Power in international relations has never been about justice or moral clarity, though we like to pretend otherwise when it serves our interests. For more than 3 decades, I have studied the mechanics of competition between great powers, and what I have learned is both simple and unsettling. States act to maximize their security in a world where no higher authority exists to protect them, and they will do whatever is necessary to survive. This is not cynicism, this is realism. It is the recognition that the international system operates in a condition of anarchy, not in the philosophical sense of chaos, but in the structural sense that there is no world government, no global sovereign capable of enforcing rules or guaranteeing the safety of nations. In such an environment, power becomes the currency of survival, and every state must acquire enough of it to ensure that no rival can threaten its existence. I wrote about this dynamic extensively in my work on offensive realism, arguing that great powers are not content merely to maintain the status quo, but instead seek to maximize their share of world power, with hegemony as the ultimate goal. The tragedy, as I have called it, is that this pursuit of security by one state invariably threatens the security of others, creating a competitive cycle that has defined human history for centuries. What we are witnessing today in the relationship between the United States, Russia, and Venezuela is not an aberration or a momentary policy failure, but rather a predictable outcome of strategic decisions made in Washington over the past 2 decades. The United States, having emerged from the Cold War as the sole superpower, embraced a foreign policy rooted in the belief that American dominance could be sustained indefinitely through economic coercion, military superiority, and the export of democratic values. Sanctions became the instrument of choice, a tool designed to punish adversaries without the political and human costs of military intervention. The logic seems sound. If you control the global financial system, if the dollar is the reserve currency used in nearly 90% of international transactions, if access to American markets and banking networks is essential for economic survival, then you can leverage that power to bend other nations to your will. For a time, it worked. Countries feared being cut off from dollar-based trade, from swift payment systems, from the intricate web of financial infrastructure that connects the modern global economy. But power, as I have argued throughout my career, is not static. It shifts, adapts, and redistributes itself in response to the actions of those who wield it. The more Washington used sanctions as a geopolitical weapon, the more it incentivized targeted nations to build alternative systems, to seek alliances with other sanctioned states, and to reduce their vulnerability to American financial leverage. This is not ideological resistance. This is structural adaptation. When you threaten a state's survival, you force it to innovate. When you isolate a nation, you push it into the arms of others who share its predicament. The Russia-Venezuela partnership that has taken shape over the past decade, and especially since the signing of a 10-year strategic partnership treaty in October of this year, is a textbook example of what realists call balancing behavior. Facing sustained American pressure, both Moscow and Caracas have concluded that their best chance of survival lies not in submission, but in cooperation, not in accepting the rules of a unipolar order, but in constructing the architecture of a multipolar one. Let me be clear about what is at stake here. This is not a story about villains and heroes. Russia and Venezuela are not democracies by any meaningful standard, and their governments have committed actions that most Americans would find objectionable. But in the realm of international politics, moral judgments are luxuries that states cannot afford when their survival is on the line. Moscow and Caracas are acting rationally, pursuing strategies designed to preserve their sovereignty and protect their core interests in an environment where the dominant power seeks to undermine them. The question we must ask ourselves is not whether Russia and Venezuela are good or bad actors, but whether American strategy has been effective in advancing American interests. And on that question, the evidence is increasingly troubling. Consider the mechanics of how sanctions were supposed to work. By targeting Venezuela's oil sector, Washington aimed to deprive the Maduro government of revenue, hoping that economic collapse would either force regime change or compel Caracas to negotiate on American terms. Between 2019 and 2023, U.S. sanctions reduced Venezuelan oil production from over 2 million barrels per day to less than 800,000, a catastrophic decline that devastated the economy and caused immense human suffering. The total value of lost oil revenue during this period exceeded $100 billion, a staggering sum for a nation already in crisis. Yet Maduro remained in power. The government adapted, finding new buyers in China and India, developing barter arrangements that bypassed dollar-based payment systems, and deepening its relationship with Russia, which provided technical assistance, political support, and access to alternative financial infrastructure. By 2024, Venezuelan oil exports had rebounded to just under 1 million barrels per day, generating approximately $17.5 billion in revenue for PDVSA, the state oil company. This was not because sanctions were lifted, though some temporary licenses were granted and then revoked, but because Venezuela found ways to operate outside the system Washington had built. The oil still flowed, the revenue still arrived, the government still survived. What changed was not Venezuelan behavior, but the structure of global commerce, which began to accommodate transactions that did not depend on American approval. This is the paradox of economic coercion. The more you use it, the more you teach your adversaries how to evade it. Sanctions do not eliminate demand for resources. They do not make oil disappear. They simply redirect trade flows, create black markets, and encourage the development of parallel financial systems. In Venezuela's case, the primary beneficiaries of this redirection were China, which now accounts for roughly 40% of Venezuelan oil exports, and Russia, which has positioned itself as both a political ally and an economic partner capable of providing the technology, infrastructure, and financial services that Western companies once supplied. The Russia-Venezuela treaty signed in October represents the formalization of a relationship that has been developing for years but has now entered a new phase. The agreement, which spans 10 years with automatic 5-year renewals, covers cooperation in energy, mining, finance, intelligence, and military affairs. It explicitly calls for the creation of financial infrastructure independent of Western systems, a direct challenge to dollar hegemony and SWIFT-based payment networks. President Maduro signed the treaty into law during a ceremony at the Miraflores Palace, describing it as the foundation for a decade of strategic collaboration and thanking the National Assembly for its unanimous approval. Russian Ambassador Sergei Melik Bagdasarov attended the signing, underscoring Moscow's commitment to the partnership. What makes this treaty significant is not merely its scope, but its timing and its symbolism. It comes at a moment when both Russia and Venezuela are under intense pressure from the United States, when both have concluded that accommodation with Washington is neither possible nor desirable, and when both have access to resources that give them leverage in a world increasingly hungry for energy and commodities. Russia, despite being subjected to what U.S. officials have called the most severe sanctions regime in modern history, has not collapsed. Its economy contracted in the immediate aftermath of Western measures imposed following the conflict in Ukraine, but it has since stabilized, adapting through increased trade with China, India, and other non-Western nations. Russian oil exports have remained robust, facilitated by shadow tanker fleets, non-dollar payment arrangements, and buyers willing to purchase crude at discounts. In 2024, Russian oil and gas revenues exceeded $200 billion, a figure that underscores the limits of sanctions when a targeted state controls resources the world needs and finds willing partners to help circumvent restrictions. Gold has emerged as a critical component of this strategy. Both Russia and Venezuela possess substantial gold reserves, and both have used gold as a means of securing liquidity and facilitating trade outside the dollar system. Venezuela's official gold reserves, though diminished from their peak, still amount to several billion dollars in value, and reports suggest that Russia has provided protection and logistical support for Venezuelan gold, allowing Caracas to monetize these assets despite American sanctions. The significance of gold in this context cannot be overstated. Unlike fiat currencies, which depend on the credibility of the issuing government and the institutions that manage them, gold is a tangible asset with intrinsic value, universally recognized and immune to the kind of financial sanctions that can freeze bank accounts or block SWIFT transfers. For nations facing exclusion from dollar-based commerce, gold serves as both a store of value and a medium of exchange, a form of monetary sovereignty that no external power can revoke. The BRICS nations, which include Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, have collectively accumulated over 6,000 tons of gold, representing roughly 20 to 21% of global central bank reserves. This accumulation is not accidental. It reflects a deliberate strategy to reduce dependence on the dollar and to create a buffer against the kind of financial coercion that the United States has employed with increasing frequency. China alone added more than 300 tons of gold to its reserves between November 2022 and May 2025, an 18-month buying spree that signals Beijing's long-term intention to diversify away from dollar-denominated assets. The World Gold Council's 2025 survey found that 25% of central banks intend to increase their gold holdings, a trend driven largely by concerns about the weaponization of the dollar and the risk of being targeted by sanctions. This is the structural shift that American policymakers have failed to fully appreciate. When you use the financial system as a weapon, you teach others to build defenses. When you freeze the assets of a sovereign state, as the United States and its allies did with Russian central bank reserves following the Ukraine conflict, you send a signal to every other nation that their dollar holdings are not safe, that the rules can be changed at any moment, and that financial integration with the West comes with existential risk. The result is a slow but steady erosion of dollar dominance. The dollar still accounts for the majority of global trade and reserves, but its share has been declining. Alternative payment systems are emerging, from China's cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, which was launched in 2015 and now processes transactions worth trillions of dollars annually, to various bilateral and regional arrangements that bypass SWIFT altogether. Central bank digital currencies are being tested by dozens of countries, offering the potential for direct peer-to-peer settlement without the need for dollar intermediaries. Projects like M-Bridge, a collaborative effort involving the Bank for International Settlements, the People's Bank of China, and several other central banks, are demonstrating that real-time cross-border currency swaps are not only possible but practical, reducing the friction and cost associated with traditional correspondent banking. These are not marginal experiments. They represent the early stages of a fundamental transformation in the architecture of global finance, one in which the dollar remains important but no longer indispensable, one in which sanctioned or threatened nations have options, and one in which American leverage is constrained by the availability of alternatives. This is the unintended consequence of sanctions overuse. By wielding economic coercion too broadly and too frequently, Washington has accelerated the very multipolarity it sought to prevent. Every time the United States imposes sanctions, it creates an incentive for the targeted nation and its trading partners to develop workarounds. Every time it threatens secondary sanctions against third parties who do business with adversaries, it strains relationships with allies and neutral states who resent being forced to choose sides. Every time it freezes assets or blocks transactions, it undermines confidence in the neutrality and stability of the institutions it controls. I have spent much of my career warning about the limits of American power, not because I wish to see America weaken, but because I believe that understanding those limits is essential to using power wisely. The United States remains the most formidable military force in the world, with a defense budget exceeding $800 billion annually, more than the next 10 countries combined. It possesses unparalleled technological advantages, a dynamic economy, and a network of alliances that spans the globe. But military and economic strength do not automatically translate into the ability to shape outcomes in every corner of the world, especially when the strategies employed generate resistance and adaptation rather than compliance. The tragedy of great power politics, as I have argued, is that efforts to maximize security often produce the opposite effect, triggering countermeasures that leave all parties less secure than they were before. This is what we are seeing unfold in the Russia-Venezuela relationship. Washington sanctions were intended to isolate and weaken both countries, to make them pariahs, to deny them the resources and legitimacy needed to sustain their governments. Instead, the sanctions pushed them together, gave them common cause, and forced them to innovate. The result is not a world in which America is stronger and its adversaries are weaker, but a world in which the mechanisms of American power are less effective, in which alternative centers of influence are emerging, and in which the unipolar moment that followed the Cold War is definitively over. This is not a moral judgment, it is an analytical one. The question is not whether Russia and Venezuela deserve to be sanctioned, but whether sanctions achieve the strategic objectives for which they were imposed. And if the answer is no, if sanctions are counterproductive, if they hasten the decline of American influence rather than preserving it, then we must ask ourselves what alternative approaches might serve our interests more effectively. That is the question I hope to explore as we continue this examination of the new geopolitical landscape taking shape before us, one in which gold, oil, and strategic partnerships are reshaping the balance of power in ways that demand our attention and perhaps our reconsideration of the tools we have relied upon for too long. The question we must confront is not whether the world is changing, but whether American policymakers understand the nature of that change and are prepared to adapt to it. For decades, the United States has operated under the assumption that its economic and military superiority would allow it to shape global affairs according to its preferences, that sanctions could serve as a substitute for diplomacy, and that the international order constructed after the Second World War would remain stable indefinitely. These assumptions are being tested in ways that should trouble anyone concerned with the long-term trajectory of American power. The Russia-Venezuela partnership is not an isolated phenomenon, but rather a symptom of a broader realignment taking place across the international system, one in which secondary powers are increasingly willing to challenge American primacy and to construct alternative frameworks for trade, finance, and security cooperation. This is precisely what realist theory predicts. When a hegemon uses its power in ways that threaten the vital interests of other states, those states will seek to balance against it, either by building up their own capabilities or by forming alliances with others who share their concerns. The question is not whether this balancing will occur, but how quickly and how effectively it unfolds. What we are witnessing in the relationship between Moscow and Caracas is the early stage of this process, a process that has been accelerated by the very tools Washington believed would prevent it. Let me return to the structural dynamics at play here. The international system, as I have argued throughout my work, operates in a condition of anarchy. There is no world government capable of enforcing agreements or protecting states from aggression. In such an environment, states must rely on their own resources and alliances to ensure their survival. This creates a competitive dynamic in which every state seeks to maximize its relative power, knowing that today's friend may become tomorrow's adversary, and that weakness invites exploitation. Great powers in particular have strong incentives to pursue hegemony in their region, to dominate their neighbors, and prevent the rise of peer competitors. The United States achieved regional hegemony in the Western Hemisphere in the 19th century and has spent the past century preventing any other great power from achieving similar dominance in their own regions. This is not morality. This is strategy, and it is a strategy that has served American interests remarkably well. But strategy must adapt to changing circumstances, and what worked in a unipolar moment may not work in a multipolar world. The unipolar moment, which began with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, was an anomaly in the history of international relations, a brief period in which one state enjoyed overwhelming advantages in military, economic, and technological power. That moment is over. China has emerged as a peer competitor with an economy that rivals America's in purchasing power parity terms and a military that, while still inferior to the US, in overall capability, is rapidly closing the gap in areas critical to regional dominance in East Asia. Russia, despite its economic weaknesses, remains a formidable military power with a nuclear arsenal comparable to America's and a willingness to use force to defend what it considers its core interests. These are not states that can be coerced into submission through sanctions alone. They have resources, agency, and strategic options, and when Washington attempts to isolate them, they adapt. The numbers tell a story that should be impossible to ignore. The dollar's share of global foreign exchange reserves has been declining steadily for 2 decades, from over 70% in 2000 to approximately 57.7% in the first quarter of 2025. This may seem like a gradual erosion, but in the context of international finance, where the dollar has been dominant for nearly a century, this represents a significant shift. The euro has gained ground, rising to just over 20% of reserves, its highest level since late 2022. More importantly, central banks are diversifying into gold, with BRICS nations alone holding over 6,000 tons, representing roughly 20 to 21% of global central bank reserves. These are not arbitrary decisions. Central banks are rational actors managing sovereign wealth, and their behavior reflects a calculated assessment of risk. The risk they are hedging against is not economic volatility in the traditional sense, but rather the weaponization of the dollar, the possibility that their reserves could be frozen or seized if they find themselves on the wrong side of a geopolitical dispute with Washington. This is not a hypothetical concern. In 2022, the United States and its European allies froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves, an unprecedented action that sent shockwaves through the global financial system. The message received by central bankers around the world was clear. Dollar-denominated assets are not safe if you cross the United States. The rational response to this realization is diversification, and that is precisely what we are seeing. China has been particularly aggressive in this regard, adding over 300 tons of gold to its reserves between November 2022 and May 2025. The People's Bank of China is not accumulating gold out of nostalgia for the gold standard, but as a strategic buffer against the kind of financial coercion that Russia experienced. This is the unintended consequence of sanctions maximalism. Every time Washington freezes assets or blocks transactions, it teaches other nations that integration with the dollar system comes with existential risk. The BRICS bloc, which now includes not only Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, but also newer members such as Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, has made the creation of alternative payment infrastructure a central priority. At the 17th BRICS Summit held in Rio de Janeiro earlier this year, member states formally committed to developing a system that would enhance interoperability between national financial systems, reduce dependence on SWIFT, and facilitate trade in local currencies. The technical report prepared by the BRICS Payments Task Force outlined specific measures, including the use of the new development bank as an institutional anchor, the creation of regional reinsurance systems, and the strengthening of settlement and custody infrastructure that operates independently of Western platforms. This is not rhetoric. This is concrete institutional development. The cross-border interbank payment system known as CIPS, which China launched in 2015, now processes transactions worth trillions of dollars annually and is being integrated with similar systems in other BRICS nations. Projects like M-Bridge, which involves collaboration between the Bank for International Settlements and multiple central banks, demonstrate that real-time cross-border currency swaps are technically feasible and operationally practical. These systems do not yet rival the scale or efficiency of SWIFT, which handles tens of millions of transactions daily, but they represent viable alternatives that will mature over time. The trajectory is clear. As these systems become more robust, as more nations participate, as transaction costs decline and liquidity improves, the dollar's dominance will continue to erode. This is not happening because the dollar is a weak currency or because the American economy is collapsing. It is happening because Washington has weaponized the financial system in ways that create incentives for others to exit. If you are finding this analysis valuable, I encourage you to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and activate the notification bell so you do not miss future discussions on the shifting dynamics of global power. I would also love to hear from viewers around the world. Please comment below with your city and country so we can see the geographic reach of this conversation and understand how these issues are being perceived in different regions. Now let me turn to the military dimension of the Russia-Venezuela relationship, because this is where the strategic stakes become even more apparent. In October of this year, Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro sent a letter to Russian President Vladimir Putin requesting urgent military assistance. According to documents obtained by the Washington Post, Maduro asked for help in strengthening Venezuela's air defense systems, including the delivery of 14 missile units, the restoration of several Russian-made Sukhoi Su-30 Mk-2 fighter jets that Caracas had previously purchased, overhauls of 8 engines and 5 radars, and unspecified logistical support. Maduro described the Su-30 jets as the most important deterrent the Venezuelan government possesses when facing the threat of war, a reference to escalating U.S. military activity in the Caribbean. The Venezuelan leader also sought a medium-term financing plan of 3 years through Rostec, Russia's state defense conglomerate, though the specific amount was not disclosed. Russian Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova confirmed that Moscow is prepared to respond appropriately to Venezuela's requests, emphasizing that such cooperation falls within the framework of existing bilateral military technical agreements. This is not a trivial development. It represents the extension of Russian military influence into the Western Hemisphere, a region that the United States has considered its sphere of influence since the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. For Moscow, the strategic logic is twofold. First, it establishes a forward base of influence in the Caribbean as a counterweight to NATO's expansion in Eastern Europe, creating a symmetrical pressure point that complicates American decision-making. Second, it provides access to Venezuela's vast energy resources as part of Russia's global energy network. Between 2001 and 2014, Russian arms exports to Venezuela totaled approximately $14.5 billion, including Su-30 Mk fighters, Mi-35 and Mi-17 helicopters, tanks, self-propelled artillery, and advanced air defense systems such as the S-300VM. These are not symbolic gestures. They represent significant military capabilities that enhance Venezuela's ability to resist external pressure. The Trump administration's approach to Venezuela has been erratic, oscillating between engagement and confrontation in ways that reflect broader incoherence in American foreign policy. Upon returning to the presidency, Trump appointed Richard Grenell as special envoy for Venezuela, with a mandate to negotiate a deal that would allow American companies access to Venezuela's oil and mineral resources while securing cooperation on issues related to gangs and drug trafficking. Grenell made progress, securing the release of American detainees and re-establishing deportation flights through direct communication channels with Maduro. However, Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who has long advocated for regime change in Caracas, pushed for a more aggressive approach. Rubio, whose political base includes Venezuelan and Cuban expatriates in Miami, has framed Maduro as a drug kingpin and a destabilizing force driving migration to the United States. Despite the tenuous basis for this characterization, given that Venezuela is not a major drug producer, but rather a transit point for cartels operating primarily in Colombia, Rubio succeeded in persuading Trump to authorize military strikes against small vessels suspected of drug trafficking. In early September, the United States conducted at least 16 operations targeting boats off the Venezuelan coast and in the Pacific, resulting in at least 65 casualties. These strikes were conducted without congressional authorization and without any formal declaration of hostilities, raising serious questions about the legal and strategic rationale for the use of force. What is clear is that these actions have driven Maduro further into Russia's arms, validating his claims that the United States poses an existential threat and justifying his request for enhanced military support from Moscow. This is a textbook example of how poorly conceived coercive measures can produce outcomes directly contrary to their stated objectives. The broader lesson here is that power, no matter how overwhelming, cannot be wielded indiscriminately without generating resistance. The United States currently spends approximately $849.8 billion annually on defense, more than the next 10 countries combined. In fiscal year 2024 alone, the Department of Defense allocated $61.1 billion to the F-35 combat aircraft program and $48.1 billion to new naval vessels. World military expenditure rose to $2,718 billion in 2024, an increase of 37% over the past decade, with the United States accounting for roughly a third of that total. These are staggering sums reflective of America's unmatched military capabilities, but military power is not synonymous with strategic effectiveness. The United States has been involved in continuous military operations for over 2 decades, from Afghanistan and Iraq to Libya, Syria, and now Venezuela, with mixed results at best. The costs have been immense, not only in dollars, but in lives, credibility, and international goodwill, and yet the pattern persists. Rather than asking whether military intervention and economic coercion serve American interests, policymakers default to the tools they know, doubling down on strategies that have repeatedly failed to achieve their objectives. This is not wisdom. This is inertia. The tragedy, as I have spent much of my career explaining, is that this competitive dynamic is difficult to escape. States trapped in an anarchic system cannot afford to trust one another, because trust without enforcement mechanisms is a vulnerability that rivals can exploit. This is the security dilemma at the heart of international relations. Measures taken by one state to enhance its security invariably threaten the security of others, prompting countermeasures that leave everyone worse off. NATO's expansion eastward, which I have argued for years was a profound strategic mistake, is a perfect illustration of this dynamic. From Washington's perspective, NATO enlargement was about extending the zone of democratic peace, integrating former Soviet states into Western institutions, and ensuring stability in Europe. From Moscow's perspective, it was an existential threat, the encirclement of Russia by a hostile military alliance that had repeatedly demonstrated its willingness to use force, from the Balkans to the Middle East. The Russian response was predictable. It included the annexation of Crimea in 2014, military intervention in Syria, and ultimately the invasion of Ukraine in 2022. These actions were not the result of Russian aggression in the abstract, but rather a reaction to what Moscow perceived as an intolerable threat to its core interests. I do not say this to excuse Russian behavior, which has been brutal and destructive, but to explain it. If we cannot understand why adversaries act as they do, we cannot formulate effective strategies to manage those adversaries. And if our own actions contribute to the threats we face, then we must be willing to acknowledge that and adjust accordingly. This requires a level of strategic introspection that has been largely absent from American foreign policy discourse for the past 3 decades. We prefer simple narratives in which we are the forces of good confronting the forces of evil, narratives that absolve us of responsibility for the consequences of our choices. But international relations is not a morality play. It is a competitive arena in which all states, including the United States, pursue their interests, sometimes wisely and sometimes foolishly. The Russia-Venezuela partnership is a consequence of choices made in Washington, choices to impose sweeping sanctions, to pursue regime change, to expand military alliances into regions that rival powers consider vital to their security. These choices have generated the balancing behavior we are now observing, and they will continue to generate such behavior unless we change course. The question is whether we possess the wisdom and the humility to do so before the costs become unbearable.